My name is Elena Vance. I am 34 years old, and I spend my days drafting the quiet language that decides who inherits what after the funeral. So when my adoptive parents, Richard and Diane, reserved the corner table at LeClaire, I knew immediately this wasn't a birthday dinner. It was a deposition. My mother adjusted her silk scarf. My father slid a thin leather portfolio across the white tablecloth until it touched my water glass. "We've always done our best for you," Diane began, her voice polished with practiced care. "But the caregiver stipend ended when you were a child. At 34, you're simply no longer useful to us." They had already filed the paperwork. Disinheritance. Clean. Final. I didn't cry. I didn't speak. I just rested my hand flat on the manila folder resting beside my plate, feeling the crisp edge of the documents inside. I had spent 6 months preparing for this exact moment. And what neither of them knew was that 3 tables behind my mother's chair, seated quietly beneath the warm brass lights, was the family I had spent a lifetime looking for. They were waiting. And for the first time, so was I. To understand why I didn't flinch at their words, you have to understand the arithmetic of my childhood. In our house, affection was measured in efficiency. My birthdays weren't celebrations, they were line items. While my cousin Brett got bounce houses and catered silver trays, I got a single grocery store cupcake with 1 wax candle pressed into the frosting. My aunt would smile and say, "We can only do one nice thing a month, honey." It sounded kind. It was actually an explanation of my size. By age 9, I stopped asking for cake. I learned that a child who asks for less is cheaper to keep. I told myself it was practical. I didn't realize I was being priced. The only person who ever made me feel like a person instead of an expense was Nana Ruth. She was my father's mother, but she loved without a ledger. When I was 12 and crying because Brett told me I wasn't a real Mercer, she didn't offer empty comfort. She put down her dish towel, held my chin, and said the sentence I carried for 22 years, "You were chosen, sweetheart. Not collected." Then she made me a grilled cheese and let me stay up too late. She died when I was 32. 2 years later, her absence finally made room for the truth I'd been too busy surviving to see. By 34, I was a senior paralegal at a downtown trusts and estates firm. I spent my days inside other people's wealth, drafting beneficiary clauses, mapping distribution schedules, and explaining to grieving widows exactly what they were owed. I could read a trust document like some people read a face. I knew the precise legal language of belonging. The irony wasn't lost on me. I could set a flawless boundary for a stranger, protect a total stranger's inheritance, and spot a loophole from 3 pages away. But I couldn't, for the life of me, ask my own family to want me without a price tag. I was so busy auditing other people's legacies that I never checked the math in my own home. I thought being needed was the same as being loved. I didn't know yet that a cleared check doesn't keep a promise. And I certainly didn't know that Nana Ruth hadn't just left me a memory. She'd left me a paper trail. 6 months before that dinner, the arithmetic finally shifted. I was at the county clerk's office pulling a routine property transfer for a client when I noticed Nana Ruth's name on a secondary filing. Professional habit made me request the full estate packet. What I found wasn't just a will. It was an irrevocable caregiver trust, executed 3 years before her death and administered by a corporate trustee my parents couldn't influence, override, or dissolve. The language was precise. Caregiver distributions to Richard and Diane Mercer would continue monthly, contingent upon my residence and welfare, until my 34th birthday. Upon that date, all distributions would terminate immediately. The remainder, substantial, liquid, and entirely separate from their personal estate, would pass directly to me. I sat in my car with the printed schedule and let the numbers settle. They hadn't been generous. They'd been compensated. And their compensation had an expiration date. I finally understood the urgency behind their sudden coldness. The clock wasn't just ticking, it was about to strike midnight, In those same 6 months, I did something I'd avoided for years. I registered with the state adoption reunion registry. I didn't do it to replace my family. I did it to stop guessing who I was. A letter arrived from a woman named Clara Hayes. She wrote that she was 19 when I was born. That she had thought of me every March, and that she had never stopped saving me a seat. Over careful phone calls and quiet coffee meetings, I met Clara, her husband Ben, and their son Leo. They didn't ask for money. They didn't ask for a role. They just asked if I was okay. For the first time, I learned what it felt like to be wanted without a utility attached. When my mother finally called to invite me to celebrate properly, I didn't feel fear. I felt alignment. I made 2 reservations at LeClaire under different names. Table 4 for the Mercers. Table 11, 3 rows back, for the Hayes family. I told them to arrive quietly, to order normally, and to simply be present. I wasn't setting a trap. I was just ensuring that when the truth was finally read aloud, I wouldn't have to hear it alone. The ledger was about to balance. I just needed to be ready to turn the page. My mother uncapped a pen and set it across a single page like a small, calculated gift. "It's just an acknowledgement," she said, her voice dropping to that rehearsed, maternal register. "That you understand the situation. Sign it, and we can all have a civilized dinner and go our separate ways." I didn't need to read past the first paragraph. I've drafted that exact boilerplate 100 times. "The undersigned hereby waives and forever releases any claim, interest, or expectancy." It wasn't an acknowledgement. It was a waiver disguised as closure. They wanted my signature while the shock was still fresh, before the paralegal in me could override the daughter they assumed was breaking. They were counting on my wound. They didn't know it had a trust attached to it. I left the pen exactly where it lay. My father's eyes kept flicking to my manila folder. I watched the realization climb up his neck in a slow, red tide. Richard had always handled the finances. He was doing the arithmetic now, and the answer was beginning to terrify him. That's when Aunt Renee arrived, trailing Brett behind her like a prop. "What a coincidence," Renee said, pressing a cold cheek to mine before pulling up a chair uninvited. "We just want what's best for the family. Families have to make hard choices about who's really part of them. You've always been practical, Elena. You understand that blood looks after blood." There it was. The word they'd been seeding in group chats all year, finally spoken at the table it was built for. I looked at Renee, who had once explained to an 8-year-old why she wasn't worth a party, and felt the last thread of obligation snap. These weren't people I was losing. They were weights I was finally setting down. Across the table, my father wasn't joining the chorus. He was staring at his hands. Then, under Renee's chatter, he leaned in and whispered, "Just for me, your grandmother loved you." He stopped there. For a second, I saw the man he might have been if he'd ever chosen courage over comfort. His eyes were wet. But then he looked at my mother, who watched him like a handler watching a dog stray toward traffic. He sat back. He picked up his water. The almost apology died in his throat. I didn't hate him for it. You can't hate a man for being exactly the weight you always knew he was. But I finally understood the rush. He knew about the trust. He knew the date was coming. And he was desperate to get my signature before I learned what his mother had actually built for me. So I asked him a question. Not as a daughter. In the flat, precise tone I use at the firm when I've found a fatal flaw in a filing. "Dad," I said, "which instrument did you file under? Your personal estate, or Nana's trust?" The table went still. My mother's wine glass paused midair. Renee's manicured hand stopped tapping. Richard blinked at me like I'd suddenly spoken a language he only half recognized. In 8 words, I'd told them 3 things they hadn't budgeted for. I knew the difference. I knew which one mattered. And I'd known long enough to prepare. I didn't wait for an answer. I opened the folder. No flourish. No slammed papers. Just 3 documents laid side by side on the white linen. Exactly as I'd arrange exhibits for a client who needed to understand their own position. First, the retainer letter confirming I was represented by independent counsel. Second, the distribution schedule of the Ruth Mercer Family Trust, with the termination clause clear in black and white. Third, my original birth certificate, with Clara Hayes's name where Diane had assumed her own would be. I let the paper do what paper does best. I let it speak. My mother's face rearranged itself in real time. The cold calculation drained away, replaced by a sudden, practiced warmth that didn't quite reach her eyes. She reached across the tablecloth, fingers outstretched, trembling slightly. "Elena," she said, her voice softening into something that sounded like devotion but felt like a final negotiation. "Whatever those papers say, we're still your parents. That doesn't change. We're family." I looked at her hand hovering over the white linen. The same hand that had signed the stipend checks, that had tallied my usefulness, that had just tried to make me waive my right to exist. I didn't pull away in anger. I just didn't take it. "I know what you are," I said quietly. "And I know what I am. We're done auditing each other." I stood up. The chair leg scraped against the hardwood, a clean, sharp sound that cut through the restaurant's low murmur. I gathered the manila folder, held it flat against my chest, and looked at my mother. She had spent 25 years teaching me I had no real place anywhere. Then I told her where I was going. Plainly. Without venom. Without performance. "My birth family is sitting 3 tables behind you." I didn't wait for her to process it. I turned and walked past Renee, whose mouth had finally run out of the word blood. Past my father, who lifted his tired eyes to mine and then dropped them again. Choosing comfort one last time. 15 feet. 3 tables. 25 years of arithmetic. Behind me, I heard the heavy rustle of fabric. My mother was turning. Slowly. The way you turn when you already know the verdict and are begging the evidence to be wrong. Her gaze swept past the empty high top, past the dimly lit bar, and landed on table 11. Clara, Ben, and Leo were already on their feet. They didn't glare. They didn't gloat. They just stood, holding the quiet dignity of people who had saved a seat for decades and were finally ready to fill it. Clara met my mother's eyes, then looked at me, and her whole face opened like a window. Leo knocked his knee against the table leg in his hurry. The restaurant had gone completely still. The particular hush that falls when strangers realize they're witnessing something irrevocably true. After everything we paid for, my mother's voice finally cracked, loud and fraying, carrying across the dining room. "The schools, the roof, the years. You do this in public? You humiliate us over money?" Heads turned openly. A man at the bar set down his drink. She was screaming about receipts to a room full of people who could see exactly what was missing from her vocabulary. I didn't stop. I didn't raise my voice to meet hers. I just kept walking. I pulled out the empty chair beside Clara, sat down, and let the silence settle the account. The ledger was balanced. I was finally home. The trust executed exactly as Nana Ruth had written it. On my 34th birthday, the monthly distributions to Richard and Diane terminated by their own terms. The remainder passed to me through the corporate trustee, untouched by the will they'd spent so much money revising. You cannot disinherit someone from a trust you don't control. Their waiver, and signed, was worth precisely what it had always been, paper. I didn't sue anyone. I didn't post anything. I simply stopped answering the phone and let silence be the boundary, which is the only kind that ever holds. Within a year, they sold the house on Linden Road and moved into a smaller place. I heard later that when Aunt Renee tried to rally the family to contest, it was my father who quietly shut it down. Told them their mother had every right to leave her money where she pleased. He was right. He was also, as ever, a year too late, and saying it to the wrong room. I didn't need the apology. I was just glad he'd finally been right out loud, As for me, I spent that first real birthday eating cake at table 11 with people who got nothing from wanting me. Clara and I talk every Sunday now at 4 o'clock, the hour I used to save for Nana. Ben taught me how to grill properly. Leo still sends memes. And somewhere in a drawer at their kitchen, there's a photo album that doesn't close anymore because it finally has enough pages. Being useful was all the Mercers ever wanted from me. Being wanted was the one thing I'd never had. And it took 25 years and one terrible dinner to learn that anyone who only keeps you for the benefits has already told you, in the plainest language there is, that they were never your family at all. If someone in your life only values you when you're useful, take this as your sign to stop auditioning for a seat you already deserve. You don't have to earn the people who love you. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.